So anyway, Jordi is a director and senior researcher at the Center for Research in International Economics, professor at the University of Pompeu Fabra, and research professor at the Barcelona GSC. He has held the academic position at New York University and Columbia University. He has been a visiting professor at MIT. He's a research fellow at CPR, a research associate at NBR, and a fellow of the Econometric Society. He has served as co-editor of the Journal of the European Economic Association. He's co-director of the CPR International Macroeconomics Program. In 2012, he served as president of the European Economic Association. He is a regular consultant to the ECB, the Sveriges Riksbank, and the Norges Bank. His research interests include macroeconomics and monetary theory, and has published articles on these topics in numerous top scientific journals. And he has 55,000 citations on his works. Jordi, the floor is all yours. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your introduction and for the invitation to both of you. It's a pleasure to be here and to give this talk. Now, can you see the slides, Claudio, or do I have to?
Not yet.
Please share your screen.
I have to share them again. Okay.
Yes.
Now, no?
Yes.
Okay, good. Thank you. Excellent. Very good. So, so this is a paper on that I think it's quite timely since the ECB is conducting a review of its strategy. So in this paper, we focus on one particular aspect of that review that has to do with whether the evidence of a lower steady state real interest rate should have any impact on the design of the ECB strategy. So this joint work with Philippe Andrade, Herbert Vihan, and Julien Materon, and they are affiliated, in the case of Philippe, with the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston, and in the case of Hervé and Julien, with the Banque de France. So the usual disclaimer applies. Okay. Okay, so we have now widespread consensus, I would say, based on both empirical evidence and theoretical arguments that what we're going to call our star in this paper, that is the level of the real interest rate towards which or at which the economy would tend to settle if there were no shocks and inflation was at its target level, that interest rate has been declining, and much of that decline may be possibly maybe permanent. Okay, and there are a number of reasons that have been put forward in the literature for that decline, including demographic trends, lower productivity growth, a stronger preference for safe assets, and so on. Now, we're going to take this as given, and in fact, we're not going to take a precise stance as to what the source or the size of that decline has been, okay? But what we're going to do is to discuss the implications that this has for monetary policy, okay? Now, a first implication is kind of straightforward, at least from a qualitative point of view. If the ECB or whatever central bank is facing this decline in R star, leaves its strategy unchanged in the face of that decline in R star, and in particular, if it leaves its inflation target unchanged, one should expect a higher incidence of the so-called effective lower bound, okay? Of episodes in which the effective lower bound is binding. By the effective lower bound, we mean the lower bound on the policy rate, okay, which can be zero, or in the case of the euro area, we take it to be somewhat below zero. Okay, and the reason is simple. With an unchanged inflation, with an unchanged average inflation, lower R star will imply that on average the policy rate, the nominal policy rate, will be lower, and hence the probability that it hits the effective lower bound will be higher. Okay, with the consequent implications regarding the central bank's inability to fully stabilize the economy and to keep inflation close to its desired level. Okay. So the question that we ask is whether the monetary policy strategy should be adjusted in the face of this lower R star. Okay, and so one legitimate question that you may ask is, what do we mean exactly by the monetary policy strategy? Okay, so we want to think of the monetary policy strategy as having two components. One is the inflation target, and two is the policy rule that the central bank follows in order to attain that inflation target. Okay, so the question that you see here on the screen, we will actually split in two. So we think that's useful conceptually. And we're going to ask, given an unchanged policy rule, should the inflation target be raised? Okay, so that's the first question. And the second question is, given an unchanged inflation target, if for whatever reason the ECB wants to keep the inflation target unchanged, should the policy rule be modified and in what direction? Okay. So what we provide in this paper is a quantitative analysis based on an estimated New Keynesian model of the euro area economy. Okay, and the analysis is based on welfare, it uses a welfare criterion in order to evaluate the different policy strategies. Okay, and this is in fact a follow-up on a previous paper that was using US data, the same team of authors, and which was published recently in Brookings papers. Okay. So let me preview some of the main findings before turning into a description of what we do and a more detailed characterization of the results. The first thing the main message of our paper is that to the extent that R star is less than 2% in annual terms, okay, the current inflation target that the ECB has, namely a rate of inflation below but close to 2%, is suboptimal, okay, given the estimated rule. Okay, so that conditioning clause is important. That is, if the ECB were to follow the rule that it has followed historically, and by that we mean during the so-called Great Moderation period, okay, the current inflation target would be suboptimal if R star is less than 2%. There is a widespread agreement, and even within ECB ranks, that R star is less than 2%. Okay, so suggesting that this is a relevant situation. Now, to be more precise, if we keep that rule unchanged, if we keep the policy rule, the historical policy rule unchanged, a decrease in R star of 1 percentage point calls for an increase in pi star, that is the optimal inflation target, of 0.8 percentage points. Okay, so there is a nearly 1-for-1 adjustment in the optimal rate of inflation in response to a change in R star. Okay, and always in the opposite direction. Now we also show that there are alternatives to raising the inflation target. Okay, and the two alternatives that seem to be more effective or more powerful according to our analysis is, well, first one that is outside the scope of decision of the ECB itself, but obviously it conditions the design of its policy, which is the enactment of a very aggressive counter-cyclical fiscal policy anytime that the euro area experiences a very large recession. That's to be made precise later. And secondly, a second alternative is to modify the policy rule to incorporate a sufficiently strong makeup component. And this can take different forms, and I'll be more specifically later, but the idea is that by a makeup component, we mean a component which makes the central bank seek to offset some of the inflation deviations from target in the past. Okay, so to compensate for past deviations of inflation from target with current deviations from target of the opposite sign. Okay, so that's what we mean by a makeup component. Very good. Just to very briefly, without getting into specific papers, this paper falls into a small but growing literature that seeks to quantify what the optimal inflation target should be. Now, this literature started with a number of papers that carried out that analysis using a model not necessarily too different from the model we're going to use, but ignoring the existence of a zero lower bound. Okay. Now, more recently, there are a few papers by Quavion et al. And others that have incorporated the zero lower bound or the effective lower bound constraint in the analysis. And obviously, that's an important element given the question being asked. Okay. There are also a number of papers by Kiley and Roberts and Bernanke, Kiley and Roberts in particular, that have quantified the benefits or the potential benefits of alternative policy rules, okay, in addition to changes in the inflation target. Okay, so our paper is also related to that particular branch of the literature that again puts a strong emphasis on the existence, on the constraints imposed by the zero lower bound or the effective lower bound. Now, what's the main novelty of our contribution, if anything? Well, we make an explicit analysis of the relation between R star and pi star. It's between the steady state real interest rate and the optimal inflation target. And as I said, we don't take a stand on what R star is. So what we deliver essentially is a function that gives you the optimal inflation target as a function of R star. Okay. Now, the analysis obviously has all kinds of caveats, as in any analysis of this sort. The one that I think is more important, that I want to stress, but there's nothing we can do about it, is that this is very much what you could call a within the model analysis. Okay, we're going to take the model seriously, literally, and we're going to conduct our analysis, under the assumption that that model provides a reasonable representation of the euro area economy. Okay. So the model, let me just spend 1 minute describing the model. I'm not going to, I will show you very few equations. First, because, going into the, for those of you whom, if anyone who is not familiar with the model, it would be impossible with the limited amount of time that we have to describe it in detail. Now, most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the model, so just a simple description will do, since it's very standard. Okay, so it's a medium-scale New Keynesian model. Okay, with non-zero trend inflation. We have to allow for non-zero trend inflation, since one of the objectives is to analyze the implications of alternative steady state or trend inflation rates. The model displays staggered price and wage setting a la Calvo. Okay, so both the sticky prices and sticky nominal wages. And there is imperfect indexation of prices to lagged price inflation and of wages to lagged price inflation and productivity. Okay, and there are a number of shocks. You see them here: risk premium, marginal utility of consumption, technology, monetary policy, price and wage markups. And there is okay, and the model is such, given our assumptions, in particular, to be very specific, our assumption of log utility of consumption, our model implies that in the steady state, or if you want, along a balanced growth path, okay, because we're allowing for trend growth, the real interest rate, R star, is given by the sum of two parameters. Rho, which is the representative household discount rate, and mu z, which is the growth rate of technology parameter. So it's a measure of technical progress. Okay, that means that the kind of declines in R star that we want to consider may be the result of two changes in the model: a lower rho and a lower mu. Lower discount rate or a lower productivity growth. So we're going to analyze both possible sources separately, okay? Now here's a key equation, what we call the baseline monetary policy rule, okay? So it's the policy rule that we estimate for the period before the financial crisis. And it takes the following form, okay? It's a rule for what we call the shadow rate, okay, or notional rate, ITN. Okay, so this is the policy rate. It's a notional version of the policy rate, or a shadow version. Okay, and that shadow rate is assumed to follow a relatively standard Taylor type rule with partial adjustment. So notice that it depends on its lag, and it depends on the deviations of inflation from a target, and it depends on the output gap, XT. Yet in addition, there is a monetary, well, allowing for a monetary policy shock, okay? Now, in what, okay, so a couple of comments. Well, let me finish describing the rule. So this is the rule followed by the shadow rate, okay? If the shadow rate, according to this rule, is above the effective lower bound, which we denote by E, okay, then the central bank sets the policy rate to be equal to the shadow rate. If the shadow rate is below the effective lower bound, then the central bank sets the policy rate at the effective lower bound. Okay, so this is, this is what is often referred to as a truncated Taylor type rule. Okay, so that's the rule. Now, a couple of comments. First, and this is central to the paper, whenever we talk in the paper about an inflation target, okay, and much of our analysis has to do with determining the optimal value for that inflation target, what we refer is the value of this parameter in the rule, this pi. Okay, so that's the inflation target. That's what we mean by the inflation target, which is different in general, will be different or may be different from average inflation, okay, for a number of reasons, okay, because of the non-linearities in the equilibrium, essentially. Okay, so that's the first observation. The second observation is that this rule, the shadow rule, contains what we can call a forward guidance component that has to do with the presence of this lag term here. Okay, so the idea is the following. Suppose that there is a large adverse shock that brings inflation and the output gap down, okay, and that make the shadow rate go down below the effective lower bound, okay? In that case, the policy rate will be set at the effective lower bound. But now suppose that the economy recovers, okay, and and maybe inflation and output gap are back to their target levels. Still, because of the presence of this lag term here, okay, if rho I is positive and high, the shadow rate may remain persistently, even though the economy has recovered, so to speak, the shadow rate may remain persistently below the effective lower bound. And hence, it may be the case that the central bank keeps the policy rate at the effective lower bound for a protracted period of time, even though the economy has recovered. Okay, so that's what people usually refer to as lower for longer policies or forward guidance policies, and they are embedded, if you want, in this rule, and they have to do with the size of this coefficient rho I. Okay. Very good. I think that's all I had to say about the model. You know, I'm not going to go into the details of a solution method. Let me just say that, well, all quantities are or several variables in the model are non-stationary because technology is assumed to follow a random walk. It's not non-stationary. So what we do is to detrend all those non-stationary quantities by and some prices like the real wages and so on by the technology parameter. Okay, so that we have the equilibrium conditions that are in terms of variables that are stationary in equilibrium. And then we log linearize those equilibrium conditions around the deterministic steady state, okay? And we solve for the equilibrium under the effective lower bound, okay, using the approach that Bodenstein et al. And Guerrieri and Iacoviello have proposed, and that involves the, you know, that allows for these occasional binding zero lower bound or effective lower bound constraints. Okay. Now, as I said at the beginning, we estimate the model using euro area data. However, we calibrate some parameters that cannot be identified separately. Okay, so the parameters that we calibrate, are the following. This parameter 1 over phi corresponds to the elasticity of output with respect to labor in the production function. Okay, so which is a Cobb-Douglas type production function. So we set it to 0.7, which is a conventional value. Excuse me. There is a parameter theta p that determines the elasticity of substitution among goods, okay, and which will determine the price markup in the steady state. Okay, so we set that parameter to 4.3, which implies a price markup of 30%. And again, we follow the calibration here by Christoffel and co-authors of the new area white model at the ECB, using independent evidence on average price markups based on or coming from some OECD studies. Okay, and the same for the elasticity theta W, which is the elasticity of substitution between different labor types, which we set to 3.9, implying a wage markup of 35%. Again, the source is the same. Okay. Now, the effective as to the effective lower bound, we assume that the current deposit rate on the current deposit rate or the current interest rate on the deposit facility at the ECB, which is minus 0.5% in annual terms, is the relevant effective lower bound. Okay, and of course our model is quarterly, so we have to divide that by 4. Okay. Now, the remaining parameters are estimated using a Bayesian approach on the model without the zero lower bound. Okay, And the sample period, 85-2008, a period for which the zero lower bound was, or the effective lower bound was not binding, and it was perceived that it would not be binding ever, okay, or with very low probability, okay. Now we have to specify priors for the different parameters. In particular, our priors for these three parameters that I introduced earlier are consistent with the average inflation rate, the average GDP growth, and the average real interest rate during the period, during our sample period. This is the vector observables that we use. So GDP, the GDP deflator, the nominal wage, all the three of them in growth rates, and also the short-term rate. Okay, and let me just show you. Of course, the model here, I could show you, by some of our estimates and some properties of the estimated model and so on, but we don't have much time. So let me just show you one particular property of the model, of the estimated model, which is central to our analysis and the question that we want to address. Okay, suppose that we set the inflation target at 2%. Okay, in annual terms. Okay, so here, what you see here is a plot of the frequency with which the effective lower bound will be binding in simulations of the model as a function of alternative values of R star. Okay, where R star here, changes in R star are assumed to be the result of changes in the rate of technical progress, mu z. Okay, so you can see, and again, this should not be surprising, but I think I want you to get a sense of the magnitudes involved, or the order of magnitude of this ELB incidence implied by the model. Okay, so as I was saying, not surprisingly, a decrease in R star, okay, increases the incidence of effective lower bound or binding effective lower bound episodes. Okay, so, and the slope, this is not exactly linear, but if you look at the local slope around the value of R star of say 2%, that local slope is around -5. Okay, so I would like you to keep that in mind. I'll show you an alternative value, some alternative numbers later. Okay, so that means that for each percentage point of decrease in R star, the probability, the increase in the probability of, or the increase in the fraction of time that the economy spends at the ELB is 5 percentage points, okay, which is substantial. Obviously, some of the estimates now of R star that are circulating within the ECB, well, are not far from zero, okay, which means that given the estimated historical policy rule, given a target of inflation of 2%, okay, the euro area, according to our model, would be at the effective lower bound about 1/4 of the time, which this is obviously, this is a very high value. Okay, very good. Now, how do we determine the optimal inflation target? Well, first, we derive a second order approximation to the expected utility of the household. Okay, so this would be the welfare, the expected utility of the household as a function of the inflation target pi, given the remaining parameters that are collected in a vector theta. And the optimal inflation target for any given set of parameters is just the value of pi, okay, that maximizes this expected utility. Okay, and we compute this pi star, okay, which is the maximum, okay, the value of pi that maximizes this objective function. We compute this pi star using numerical simulations, okay, that allow for this binding effective lower bound, and with theta being the mean of the posterior distribution of our parameter estimates. Okay. Very good. Now, just to, so what I think an interesting question, certainly one that we were curious about, was to analyze the extent to which the ECB inflation, the current inflation target of the ECB, was close to being optimal. Okay, at least during the the period, during the Great Moderation period. Let me put it this way: the period before the crisis. Okay. So we examined that question as a, if you want, as a test of the credibility of the model. Okay. We examined that question as follows. First, we imposed, just for this exercise, we imposed an effective lower bound of 0. Okay. The reason is that when the ECB set its inflation target first in 1998 and then later on in 2003 when it reviewed its strategy, its perceived effective lower bound was 0, and that's very clear in the documentation that provides all the background analysis for those decisions. Okay, so we take here we adopt the mindset of the ECB at that time, and we impose that a 0 effective lower bound, and then we compute using our estimated model. We compute the optimal inflation target. Okay, so what you see here, the blue line, is just the expected utility of the representative household, and quite strikingly, I have to say, and to our amazement, the optimal inflation target that comes out of that analysis is 1.8, which is certainly within the reasonable interpretation of what below but close to 2% implies. Okay, so that's, I think we take this as a positive assessment of the credibility of the model as a model describing at least how the ECB or a model consistent with how the ECB set its inflation target when it did so some years ago. Okay, very good. Now we go back to our main analysis, and what I'm going to show you now is the key figure in the paper, which is the baseline relation between R star and pi star. Okay, and I'll show you two. In one, R star changes as a result of changes in the rate of technical progress, mu z, and in the other one as a result of changes in rho, keeping all the other parameters at their posterior means. Okay. Okay. So this is the blue line. Let's start with the blue line. Shows pi star. Okay, the optimal inflation target as a function of R star. Okay. So as you can see, there is a very strong and clear inverse relationship between the two, not surprisingly. Okay. And in the range of values of R star that we think is relevant, that relationship is nearly linear, and with a local slope of minus 0.8, as I said earlier. Okay, that means that the decline in the R star of 1 percentage point calls for an increase in the inflation target of 0.8 percentage points. Okay. Now, what you see here with the dashed line, marked with the dashed line, are the this 2.8% is the estimated R star during the Great Moderation. Okay, a value that now is viewed as completely obsolete. Okay, 2.8%. Given that R star, the optimal inflation target is 1.4%. Okay, which is below the 1.8% that I showed you earlier, because now we are taking the effective lower bound to be minus 0.5%, not 0, as in the exercise that I showed you earlier. Okay, but you can see here that, and here's the main result that I had emphasized earlier, that if R star is less than 2%, okay, the optimal inflation target is above 2%. Okay. Now, very good. Now you can see that this is truncated for relatively high values of R star, but that's because at this point we haven't been able to simulate the model without the code somehow collapsing for lower values of R star. Okay, but in some analysis that we do, in which we adjust R star all the way to 0, using a trick that involves, setting either rho at a very low value to begin with, and then changing mu z, or setting mu z at a very low value to begin with, and then changing rho, we see that that relationship, okay, in that case, our simulations work fine, and that relationship remains close to linear. Okay, so in what follows, I'm going to assume implicitly that this relationship here goes all the way to 0, and with the relationship being linear or close to linear. Okay. Now notice that it makes a difference. I don't have time to discuss why, but it makes a difference whether changes in R star are the result of changes in technical progress, the blue line, or in the discount rate, the red line, for values of R star that are very high. But if R star is less than 4%, which is the relevant range, we think that there's essentially no difference between, it makes no difference what is the source of the change in R star. By the way, these differences here have to do with the fact that in one case, in the case of technical progress, changes in technical progress, the rate of real wage growth also needs to be changed, and that requires optimally either deflation, or I should say both deflation of prices and inflation of wages. Okay, that's optimal. That's why we have, in that case, that it is optimal to have negative price inflation. Okay, because that helps increase real wages without having to rely on too high wage inflation, which is also distorting. Okay, that's not the case when rho is the source of a change in R star. Very good. Now, what is the incidence of the effective lower bound when the central bank chooses the inflation target optimally? Okay, so you see it here. This is a picture which is analogous to the one I showed you earlier, this one. But here I was keeping the inflation target at 2%. And now the inflation target is adjusted optimally when R star changes. And you can see, well, there is still a downward relationship, meaning that the incidence of the effective lower bound increases, of effective lower bound episodes increases as R star goes down, but this curve is much flatter. The local slope is now just minus 1.5, whereas before it was minus 5. Okay, so there is a decrease in R star leads to an increase in the incidence of the incidence of the effective lower bound, but given the adjustment of the inflation target, that increase is relatively small. Okay, these are the pictures that I showed you earlier. Okay, very good, and that's all in terms of changing determining the inflation target, the optimal inflation target as a function of R star, keeping unchanged the estimated policy rule. Okay, that's what we have done so far. Okay, now let's look. We're going to consider alternative policy regimes. Okay, and the first one involves enacting an emergency fiscal package whenever the cumulative output gap is minus 6%. Okay, we think of this as a very large and unusual recession, with an order of magnitude similar to the Great Recession. Okay, so whenever that happens, then automatically there is an increase in government purchases that amount to 4% of output, and that increase is persistent with a persistent parameter of 0.85. Okay, eventually the increase dies out. Okay, so the blue line, so here is again the same R star pi star locus. The blue line is the one that we had seen earlier. Okay, and now I'm restricting myself to changes in R star that are the result of changes in mu z. Okay, and the red line is the one the one when this countercyclical fiscal policy is in place. Okay, so you can see that it has shifted downward substantially, meaning that now it is possible, well, for any R star, the optimal inflation target is lower, and meaning that it is possible to maintain an inflation target below 2% or close to below 2%, even for values of R star that are below 2. Okay, so roughly, again, if we extrapolate this, we have that we could go, you know, we could have the optimal inflation target would be 2% for an R star of about 1%. Okay, if R star were to go below that, one would need to raise the inflation target. Okay, but again, this points to the importance of or the potential usefulness of having you know, systematic countercyclical fiscal policy in, even if it's restricted only to large recessions. Okay. Now let's consider alternative as an alternative strategy, alternative values for the effective lower bound. Again, the baseline is minus 0.5, so let's consider 0. Okay, what the ECB used to view as its baseline, as its effective lower bound, or minus 0.8, which is, we think, as low as the one the ECB would consider going, perhaps. Okay, so again, the blue is the baseline, and we can see from here that you know, in particular, when we lower the effective lower bound to minus 0.8, that's the purple line, you know, the optimal inflation target function shifts downward, but very little. Okay, so it makes very little, it has little impact. And I don't think anyone would argue that the ECB would consider going below minus 0.8. So we don't, you know, we don't try to push this further down. Okay, so we don't think this will. We don't think this would help much in terms of allowing to keep an inflation target close to 2%, okay, in the face of a decline in R star. Now let's consider alternative inertia coefficients, okay? Our baseline estimate of rho I is 0.87, okay? So let's see what happens if we raise it to 0.95. And again, we want to interpret this as the ECB pursuing more aggressive, lower for longer policies. Okay. Now, this is what happens. Okay. So the baseline again is 0.8, the blue line, and the purple line tells us what happens, what the optimal inflation target is for each possible value of R star when rho I is 0.95. And you can see that this makes a huge difference. Okay. So that, you know, even with a value of R star close to 0, the ECB would be able to maintain an inflation target below 2% as an optimal inflation target, close to below, but close to 2%. Okay. So that again, this works very effectively. Okay. Here's a fourth alternative strategy. Okay. Now we're going to. This is more dramatic because we're going to change the interest rate rule. Now we're going to have the central bank respond to deviations of the price level in logs from a price level target, where the price level target increases at the rate of inflation pi. Okay, and again, our goal is to determine what this rate of inflation pi is. Okay, and again, the coefficient AP now is taken to be either 0.1 or 1. Again, somewhat arbitrarily. We try just two alternative values. And again, this makes a huge difference because now you see the optimal inflation target, even for the period before during the great moderation period, is below zero. That's the optimal inflation target, okay? And even for values of R star very low, the optimal inflation target remains very low. As you can see, the values, close to 0.5% or so, okay? So again, this rule is extremely powerful at stabilizing the economy and without and preventing effective lower bound episodes without the need to increase the inflation target much. Okay, so with very low inflation targets, so as a result, in very low inflation targets remain optimal. Okay. And finally, let me consider this rule that is being discussed quite often these days. It's average inflation targeting. Okay, it's a version of what people refer to as average inflation targeting. So now the interest rate rule responds to inflation or the deviation of inflation from the target, but instead of being the rate of inflation that the central bank responds to is no longer the current inflation rate, but instead it's an average, a simple average of the rate of inflation over the period over the previous H quarters. Okay, so in our baseline exercise, we take H to be 1 because the central bank was responding only to the current quarter inflation. But we consider now alternative values, 16 and 32 quarters, that is 4 years and 8 years, okay? So the central bank responds to average inflation over the past 4 years or over the past 8 years, okay? That means, so that's an example, like the price level targeting of a makeup strategy in the sense that any deviation of inflation from the target in the past, okay, is taken into account today when setting the inflation target, and it's trying to be is being made up or responded to by the central bank. Okay, so let me show you now the corresponding pictures. The blue line is the baseline in which under the assumption that the central bank responds only to the current inflation rate, and the red line corresponds to a 4-year window when computing the rate of inflation that the central bank responds to, and the purple line to an 8-year window. Okay, and you can see that again, this is very powerful at bringing down the optimal inflation target for any R star, or equivalently at allowing the central bank to keep a relatively low inflation target in the face of a decline in R star. Okay, so we see here in particular with an 8-year window, okay, it would be possible if we extrapolate this to keep an inflation target around 2%, even if R star was close to 0. Okay, very good. So these are the main results that I wanted to show you. So let me conclude here. And again, this is just I'll leave this slide here. Just a summary of the main results. So that, again, the main purpose of the paper was to provide a quantitative assessment of the optimal inflation target as a function of R star, and we have shown that under the baseline rule, under the historical rule of the ECB, a local decline in R star calls for a close to 1-for-1 increase in the inflation target. Okay, and the interpretation for this is clear. At the levels of inflation that we're talking about, the model implies that costs of increasing inflation are low at the margin, okay, this compared to the stabilization benefits of having a higher nominal rate, okay, because having a higher nominal rate on average reduces the incidence of the effective lower bound, and that's highly desirable from a welfare point of view. Okay. Now, if R star has declined and the rule is unchanged, the current below but close to 2% target is suboptimal. That's a clear message of our analysis. Now, this can be overturned, the message can be overturned if there was a change in regime that involved either more aggressive counter-cyclical fiscal policies in periods of large recessions in the euro area, or more aggressive lower for longer forward guidance type policies, or the adoption of average inflation targeting instead of the current flexible inflation targeting. Okay. Now, just to conclude, let me just mention two caveats of make-up policies as opposed to inflation targets, as opposed to raising the inflation target. These make-up policies, are very effective in theory, in our simulations are very effective, but it's important to realize that they rely heavily on what we call expectational channels, on two expectational channels. Okay, first, the assumption of rational expectations, okay, that we adopt in our analysis, that is that agents fully understand the logic of the model, and in particular, they fully understand the implications of the rule that has been adopted by the central bank in terms of what future interest rates will be. Okay, so they anticipate correctly the future nominal rates implied by the rule. And secondly, second channel that is very important, or a second assumption that is very important in making those expectational channels powerful is the assumption of full credibility of the central bank, okay, and of the rule that the central bank adopts. All the rules that have a makeup component imply some time inconsistency sooner or later, okay? So again, so in order for them to be effective, the central bank has to be credible and has to be perceived that it will actually stick to those rules even though they are exposed time inconsistent. Okay. Now these caveats suggests obviously point to an advantage, some comparative advantage of raising the inflation target, because raising the inflation target does not rely on any of these expectational channels. The central bank could stick to its conventional flexible inflation targeting rule without the need of relying so much on these expectational channels. Okay, so let me stop here. I think I've gone beyond my allocated time, so I apologize for that, and I'm very happy to take any questions that you may have. Thank you for your attention.